Hi, I'm Dorothy. Last Tuesday, my daughter Bethany walked into my kitchen holding a stack of assisted living brochures and said, "Mom, you're just a burden now. We can't keep pretending you can live alone." Behind her stood my son Trevor with his arms crossed, nodding like they'd rehearsed this moment. What they didn't know was that I'd been listening to their phone calls for weeks, planning how to divide up my house and my assets the moment I was gone. They had no idea what leaving would actually cost them. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light was filtering through the lace curtains I'd hung in this kitchen 32 years ago, back when Bethany was still losing teeth and Trevor was teaching himself guitar in the garage. The same kitchen where I'd bandaged their scraped knees, helped with homework, and celebrated every birthday, graduation, and achievement they'd ever had. Now it felt like a courtroom. "We've already looked at Sunset Manor," Bethany continued, her voice taking on that patronizing tone she used with her own children when they misbehaved. "It's only 20 minutes away, and they have activities. Bingo, crafts, movie nights. You'll make friends." I kept stirring my coffee, watching the cream swirl in slow circles. They thought silence meant confusion, weakness, the beginning of cognitive decline. They had no idea silence was my way of listening, calculating, remembering everything. "The house is too big for you now," Trevor added, glancing around like he was already measuring furniture. "All these stairs, the yard maintenance, the utilities, it's not practical anymore." Practical. The word hung in the air like smoke. This from my son, who dropped out of college twice, moved back home 4 times, and who I quietly paid off $23,000 in credit card debt for just last year. The same son who'd borrowed my car so many times I'd stopped counting, who brought his laundry over every Sunday like he was still 19. "Besides," Bethany said, sitting down across from me without being invited, "we could really use the space. Trevor's thinking about starting that consulting business, and I need somewhere for the kids to stay when Mark travels for work." There it was, the real reason, wrapped up in concern for my well-being like a gift with a beautiful bow hiding something rotten inside. I took a slow sip of my coffee. It was still hot, bitter, grounding. "And you've already decided this?" "We've been talking about it for months, Mom," Bethany said, reaching across to pat my hand like I was a child. "We're worried about you. Yesterday, you forgot to lock the front door." I hadn't forgotten. I'd been expecting the contractor to finish installing the new security system, the one they didn't know about. The one that had been recording the conversations every time they visited, thinking I was napping upstairs or puttering in the garden. "And last week, you put salt in your coffee instead of sugar." I almost smiled at that one. I'd been testing them, seeing if they were paying attention to me or just looking for evidence to support their predetermined conclusion. They'd passed the test, just not the way they thought. "We love you, Mom," Bethany continued, "but we can't keep worrying about you living alone in this big house. What if you fall? What if something happens and no one finds you for days?" What they meant was, what if something happens and we're not here to immediately claim everything you've worked for your entire life? I'd heard them on the phone with each other, voices drifting up through the heating vents they'd forgotten carried sound so well. Bethany talking about converting my sewing room into a home office. Trevor wondering if the basement could be finished into an apartment for rental income. Both of them discussing property values, inheritance taxes, and the best way to transition Mom's assets without her getting confused or resistant. They thought I was becoming the typical elderly mother, forgetful, dependent, gradually losing touch with reality. What they didn't realize was that I'd been playing chess while they were playing checkers, and I was already 7 moves ahead. "The thing is," I said quietly, setting down my cup, "I've been thinking the same thing." Both of their faces lit up with relief and something else, something that looked suspiciously like victory. "Really?" Bethany leaned forward eagerly. "I'm so glad you're being reasonable about this. I know it's hard, but it's really for the best." "When were you thinking of making the move?" Trevor asked, already pulling out his phone like he was ready to start making calls.
"How about today?" I said. The silence that followed was different from my earlier quiet. This was the kind of silence that happens when someone's entire plan suddenly accelerates beyond their control. "Today?" Bethany blinked. "Don't you think that's a little rushed? We haven't even toured Sunset Manor yet, or filled out the paperwork, or—" "Oh, I'm not going to Sunset Manor," I said, standing up and walking to the kitchen window. Outside, the moving truck I'd secretly arranged was pulling into the driveway. "What moving truck, Mom? What's going on?"
I turned back to face them, and for the first time in months, I let them see me clearly. Not the confused, fading woman they'd convinced themselves I'd become, but the sharp, decisive person who'd raised them, who'd run a household and managed finances and made difficult decisions while they were still figuring out how to tie their shoes. "You said I was a burden," I said calmly. "You're absolutely right, so I'm removing the burden." The next 20 minutes unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance I'd been practicing for weeks. The movers knew exactly what to take. Items I'd quietly packed and labeled while my children thought I was sorting through old photos. My clothes, my important documents, my grandmother's china, the jewelry they'd been eyeing for years, and several boxes they couldn't see the contents of. "Where are you going?" Bethany kept asking, following me from room to room as I directed the movers. "You can't just leave without telling us where you're going." "I can, actually. I'm 71 years old, of sound mind, and capable of making my own decisions. You made that very clear when you walked in here with those brochures." Trevor was on his phone in the corner, speaking in hushed, urgent tones, probably calling his wife Sarah, or maybe his friend who worked in elder law, trying to figure out if there was some way to stop me. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known because they'd stopped really seeing me years ago, was that this moment had been building for much longer than a few weeks of overheard phone calls. This had started the day Trevor asked me to co-sign for his second mortgage, the day Bethany suggested I update my will to be more tax efficient, the day I realized my children no longer saw me as their mother, but an asset to be managed, a problem to be solved, a resource to be preserved until they were ready to claim it. They'd forgotten that I was the woman who'd put myself through night school while raising them alone after their father left. The woman who'd built a small catering business from nothing, who'd invested carefully and saved wisely, who'd paid for their college educations and wedding down payments and countless emergencies over the years. They saw an aging burden. I saw a woman who'd finally been given permission to stop carrying people who'd forgotten how to walk on their own. The last box was loaded onto the truck. I handed the driver an envelope with the address. Somewhere in Colorado they'd never think to look. At least not immediately. Somewhere I'd been planning this new chapter longer than they'd been planning to warehouse me. "Mom, please," Bethany said. And for a moment, she sounded like the little girl who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. "Can't we talk about this?" I walked over to the kitchen counter and picked up the stack of assisted living brochures he'd brought. Flipped through them slowly, reading the cheerful descriptions of active senior living and supportive community environments. "You know what?" I said, handing them back to her. "You're absolutely right. These places do sound wonderful. You should definitely keep these." And with that, I walked out of the house I'd called home for 30 decades, leaving behind two adults who'd forgotten that the woman who raised them had taught them everything they knew about being strong. They had no idea what they'd just lost, but they were about to find out. What happens when you underestimate the wrong person? Stay tuned. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The 6-hour drive to Millbrook, Colorado gave me time to think, time to remember, time to let the weight of 32 years in that house settle into something that felt less like loss and more like liberation. My hands were steady on the steering wheel of the car I'd bought 3 months ago, the one Bethany and Trevor didn't know about. They still think I was driving the old sedan with the rattling muffler and the passenger door that stuck. That car was sitting in my garage, right where they expected it to be, maintaining the illusion that their mother was exactly where and what they thought she was. But I hadn't been that woman for a very long time. The truth was, I'd stopped being their dependent, forgetful mother the day I overheard Trevor on the phone with his financial advisor discussing how to optimize Mom's estate transition. That was 18 months ago. 18 months of watching my children circle me like vultures, mistaking patience for weakness, planning for confusion. They had no idea about the woman I'd become after their father left 23 years ago. Back then, I'd been exactly what they remembered: overwhelmed, struggling, dependent on others for help with everything from lawn care to oil changes. But necessity had been a harsh teacher, and I was an excellent student. What they didn't know was that the small catering business I'd started had grown into something much bigger. Bethany thought I'd dabbled in cooking for parties before retiring. Trevor assumed the monthly checks I received were just Social Security and their father's modest pension.
Neither of them had bothered to look closely at the woman who'd quietly built Riverside Catering into the premier event service for 3 counties. The woman who'd sold that business 5 years ago for $1.2 million and invested every penny wisely. The woman who owned 4 rental properties across the state and had been collecting steady income for years. They saw the grandmother who forgot to lock the front door. They missed the businesswoman who'd never forgotten a client's dietary restrictions or a vendor payment in 30 years of operation. My phone buzzed with another call from Bethany. I let it go to voicemail, just like the previous 7 calls. I knew exactly what she was saying without listening. "Where are you? How could you do this to us? Don't you understand we were trying to help you?" But there was something else in those calls, something they probably didn't even realize they were revealing: panic. Because somewhere in the back of their minds, they were starting to understand that their plan to help me had just collapsed, and they had no backup plan. They'd been so confident in their assessment of my decline, the salt and the coffee incident, the unlocked door, the way I'd started asking them to repeat things or explain technology I'd been using for years. They'd documented every instance like evidence in a case they were building. What they didn't realize was that I'd been building a case too. The security system I'd had installed wasn't just for my protection, it was for documentation. Every conversation, every eye roll, every moment they thought I couldn't see them calculating the value of my belongings, all of it recorded, all of it saved to a cloud storage account they'd never think to look for. The contractor who'd installed the system, Jim Hendricks, had raised an eyebrow when I'd explained what I needed. "Ma'am, you want cameras and audio in the common areas? Your family's gonna see them." "No," I had said calmly. "They're going to see the obvious ones. The real ones will be hidden." Jim had looked at me for a long moment, and I'd seen the exact second he stopped seeing a confused elderly woman and started seeing a businesswoman with a plan. "How long you been planning this?" "Longer than they've been planning theirs." The rental cabin I'd reserved 3 months ago sat at the end of a gravel road, surrounded by pine trees and the kind of silence that makes you remember who you are when no one else is around. It was modest but comfortable, with Wi-Fi strong enough for video calls and a kitchen large enough for serious cooking. Most importantly, it was completely off the grid as far as my children were concerned. They'd never think to look for me in Colorado. As far as they knew, I'd never been west of Kansas. They were wrong about that too. I had been here twice in the past 6 months, meeting with my attorney and finalizing arrangements they knew nothing about. The same attorney who'd helped me structure the sale of Riverside Catering in a way that minimized taxes and maximized long-term growth. The same one who'd helped me understand exactly what would happen to my estate if I were ever declared incompetent or coerced into a care facility. My children thought they were protecting me from making bad decisions. They had no idea I'd been protecting myself from theirs. The moving truck had arrived an hour before me, and the drivers had followed my instructions perfectly. Boxes labeled "Dorothy's room" were stacked neatly in the bedroom. Kitchen essentials went to the kitchen. Office went to the small sunroom I'd designated as my workspace. And the box labeled "Important Documents," the one that Bethany and Trevor had barely glanced at, went straight to the lockable filing cabinet I'd had delivered the week before. That box contained everything they didn't know about: bank statements showing the true scoop of my assets, property deeds for the rental units that had been quietly generating income for years, investment portfolios they'd never heard of, insurance policies with beneficiaries they'd probably be surprised to learn about.
But most importantly, it contained the legal documents I'd had prepared 6 months ago, when I first realized where their concern for my well-being was heading. Documents that would ensure my actual wishes were honored, regardless of what my children thought was best for me. Documents that would teach them the difference between caring for someone and trying to control them. I made myself a cup of tea, real tea, not the herbal stuff Bethany was always pushing on me for my health, and sat on the cabin's small porch as the sun set behind the mountains. The air was clean and thin, nothing like the humid thickness I'd left behind. My phone buzzed again. This time it was Trevor. I answered on the 4th ring. "Mom, thank God. Where are you? We've been worried sick." "I'm exactly where I told you I'd be. Somewhere better." "That's not an answer. We need to know where you are. What if something happens to you?" "Something did happen to me, Trevor. My children told me I was a burden and needed to be put away for my own good, so I took care of the problem." There was a pause. I could almost hear him trying to recalibrate, trying to figure out how to get back to the script they'd rehearsed.
Mom, you know that's not what we meant. We love you. We just want you to be safe. I am safe. But where? Trevor, I interrupted gently, do you remember what I used to tell you when you were little and you'd have a tantrum because you couldn't have something you wanted? Another pause. No? I used to tell you that wanting something and deserving it were two different things. You want to know where I am. You want to know my plans. You want to control the situation. But you haven't done anything to deserve that information. Mom, you're scaring us. For the first time in months, I smiled. Really smiled. Good. Maybe now you'll have some idea how I felt when you walked into my kitchen with those brochures and announced you'd been planning my future behind my back. We were trying to help. You were trying to manage me. There's a difference. I could hear Bethany's voice in the background, urgent and frustrated. Trevor covered the phone, but not well enough to muffle their conversation entirely. Is she okay? She sounds different. She was right. I did sound different. I sounded like myself again. I'm going to hang up now, I told Trevor. When you're ready to have a conversation instead of an intervention, you know how to reach me. Mom, wait! Oh, and Trevor, you might want to check your mail. I had some things forwarded to your house. Important things you'll want to see. I ended the call and turned off the phone. Tomorrow I'd get a new number, one that would be mine to share or withhold as I chose. Tonight I was going to cook myself a real dinner, not the bland prepackaged meals Bethany kept bringing me to make things easier, and plan the next phase of my new life, the life my children had accidentally given me permission to start. The mail I had forwarded to Trevor's house arrived on Thursday morning. I knew this because I'd set up tracking on every piece and because Sarah called me at exactly 9:47 a.m., her voice tight with confusion. Dorothy, Trevor's at work, but some strange mail came for you today. Legal documents from Whitman and Associates, and something from First National Bank that looks important. I was sitting on the cabin's porch watching a family of deer graze in the meadow beyond the trees. The morning air was crisp, clean, nothing like the oppressive atmosphere I had left behind. Oh, that's just some paperwork I needed to update, I said casually. Nothing urgent. But it says something about property transfers, and, Dorothy, there are names here I don't recognize. Addresses and places I've never heard you mention. Sarah had always been the sharpest one in the family. Unlike my children, she paid attention to details that didn't fit her expectations. It was one of the reasons I had actually liked her when Trevor first brought her home 15 years ago. I'm sure it's just routine maintenance on some old accounts, I said. You know how banks are with their paperwork. There was a pause. I can almost hear her looking more closely at the documents, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. Dorothy, one of these is from a property management company in Riverside. It looks like a quarterly report. For multiple properties. Mm-hmm, I said noncommittally, taking a sip of my coffee. Multiple properties, Dorothy, like rental income reports. For properties I never knew you owned? The deer lifted their heads, alert to some sound I couldn't hear, then bounded gracefully back into the forest. I envied their ability to sense danger and respond so decisively. Sarah, honey, I appreciate you looking out for me, but those are just some old investments. Nothing for you to worry about. Old investments that generated $43,000 last quarter? Now we were getting to the heart of it. I could hear papers rustling in the background, Sarah's voice getting more intense as she read. Dorothy, this shows regular deposits into accounts Trevor never mentioned you having rental properties. When did you buy rental properties? About 8 years ago, maybe 9. Time blurs together when you get to be my age. The silence that followed was different from Sarah's earlier confusion. This was the silence of someone realizing they had fundamentally misunderstood a situation. 8 years ago, you bought rental properties worth... Dorothy, what haven't you told us? A great many things, apparently. I heard a car door slam in the background, then Trevor's voice calling out, Sarah, why are you on the phone? Is everything okay? Trevor, you need to see this, Sarah said, and I could tell she had put me on speaker. What see? Mom, are you okay? Where are you calling from? I'm fine, Trevor. Sarah was just telling me about some mail that arrived. What mail? Trevor's voice was getting closer to the phone. I heard papers rustling again, then a sharp intake of breath. Mom, what is Riverfield Management Company? And why do they have our address? Riverfield Management was the company I'd hired to handle my rental properties when the business grew beyond what I could manage myself. Professional, discreet, and very good at what they did. Their quarterly reports were detailed, thorough, and apparently quite revealing to people who'd never known those properties existed. They managed some investments for me, I said.
Investments? Trevor's voice cracked slightly. Mom, this says you own 6 rental units across 3 different counties. 6! When did you buy 6 rental properties? Gradually, I said, when the opportunities presented themselves. Opportunities? What opportunities? You never mentioned any opportunities. You never mentioned buying property at all. I could hear Sarah in the background, still reading. Trevor, look at this bank statement. Look at the account balance. The silence that followed was longer this time. I used it to refill my coffee cup and watch a hawk circle high above the meadow. Mom, Trevor's voice was very quiet now. This account has almost $300,000 in it. $347,000, actually, though it fluctuates with the market. You have $347,000 in a checking account we never knew about? It's not a checking account, Trevor. It's a money market account. The checking account is separate. There's another account? There are several accounts. I'm not irresponsible with money, you know. I heard what sounded like someone sitting down heavily in a chair. Mom, we thought... you always seemed like you were just getting by. You clipped coupons, you drove that old car, you never bought anything expensive. I still clip coupons. They're a perfectly sensible way to save money, and that old car runs fine. But you have hundreds of thousands of dollars. I have significantly more than that, actually. The silence this time was absolute. I could picture them standing in Trevor's kitchen, staring at financial documents that revealed a woman they'd never bothered to really see. How much more? Sarah asked quietly. Enough to be comfortable. Mom, please, how much more? I considered how much to reveal, how much truth they were ready to handle, how much would serve my purposes, and how much would simply overwhelm them. The Riverside catering sale netted me just over $1.2 million after taxes. I've been investing conservatively but consistently since then, plus the rental income, plus some other small ventures. $1.2 million? Trevor's voice was barely a whisper. From the catering business. You remember the little cooking thing I did for parties? You said it was just something to keep busy. It was, and it was also a business that grew quite successfully over 23 years. I heard papers shuffling again, more frantically now. Sarah, Trevor said urgently, look for anything else. Any other documents, any other accounts, anything. Sarah, there's a letter here from something called Whitman and Associates. It's addressed to Dorothy, but it's about estate planning updates?
Estate planning, Trevor? The voice was getting higher with each revelation. That's just some routine maintenance, making sure everything is properly structured for tax purposes. What kind of estate planning, Mom? The kind that ensures my assets go where I want them to go, when I want them to go there. And where do you want them to go? I took another sip of coffee, watching the hawk settle on a high pine branch. That depends entirely on how the next few months unfold. What does that mean, Trevor? It means, Trevor, that your sister's suggestion about putting me in Sunset Manor has given me a lot to think about family, about obligations, about who really cares for whom. Mom, we do care about you. That's why we wanted you somewhere safe. You wanted me somewhere manageable. There's a difference. I heard Sarah whisper something to Trevor, but couldn't make out the words. Mom, can we please just talk about this face to face? We had no idea about any of this. If we'd known you were financially secure, we never would have suggested... What, Trevor? You never would have suggested what? The assisted living thing. We thought you were struggling financially. We thought you needed help. I see. So your concern was about my bank account, not my well-being. That's not what I meant, isn't it? Another silence, longer this time. There are more documents here, Sarah said finally. Something about charitable foundations and trusts. Dorothy, how many trusts do you have? A few. A few trusts? It's important to diversify, Sarah, especially when you're planning for the future. What kind of future planning? The kind that determines which organizations and individuals will benefit from my life's work after I'm gone. And I heard Trevor take a sharp breath. Mom, you're not dying, are you? Is that what this is about? We're all dying, Trevor. The question is what we do with the time we have left. You know that's not what I meant. I'm 71 years old and in excellent health, but I'm also old enough to understand that things can change quickly and smart enough to be prepared for various scenarios. What scenarios? Well, for instance, the scenario where my children decide I'm incompetent and try to have me declared unfit to manage my own affairs. The silence this time was deafening. We never said anything about having you declared incompetent, Trevor said carefully. Not yet. But Bethany researched it. I have the browser history from her laptop. How do you have Bethany's browser history? The same way I have recordings of your phone calls about divvying up my house and planning my asset transition. You've been recording our calls? I've been protecting myself, Trevor, just like you taught me to do when you were 16 and that boy was bothering you at school. Remember what you said? You said I should always have evidence because people will lie about what they said and did.
I could almost feel the moment when they realized the trap they'd walked into. The moment when they understood that their clever plan to manage their aging mother had been observed, documented, and countered by someone who'd been playing the game much longer than they had. Mom, Sarah said quietly, what do you want from us? I want you to understand that I'm not the helpless old woman you thought I was. I want you to realize that love and control are not the same thing. And I want you to consider the possibility that maybe, just maybe, I know what's best for my own life. And if we do that, if we understand all that, then we can have a conversation about what happens next. And if we don't? I watched the hawk spread its wings and soar out over the meadow, hunting with the patience and precision that only comes with experience. Then you'll learn what it really means when someone you love becomes a burden you can no longer manage. Bethany arrived at Trevor's house 37 minutes after Sarah's call. I knew this because Trevor had left his phone on during their frantic conversation, and I could hear everything. Car doors slamming, urgent footsteps on the front porch, and Bethany's voice cutting through the house like a blade. Where are all the documents? Show me everything. I was still on the cabin porch, my phone propped against a coffee mug,
listening to my children discover the depth of their miscalculation. The morning had warmed, and I'd moved to the shade, but my attention was completely focused on the chaos unfolding 3 states away. "Bethany, you need to see this." Sarah's voice was strained. "Your mother has been running what looks like a real estate empire for years." "That's impossible. Mom barely knows how to use an ATM." "She owns 6 rental properties, Bethany. 6! And they're generating serious income." I heard papers shuffling, then Bethany's sharp intake of breath. "This has to be a mistake. These numbers can't be right." "I called the property management company," Trevor said quietly. "It's real, all of it." "You called them without talking to Mom first?" I needed to understand what we were looking at. There was a pause. I could picture Bethany's expression, the same look she'd worn as a child when her carefully constructed version of reality suddenly collapsed. "What did they tell you?" "That Dorothy Hensley has been one of their most successful clients for 8 years, that she started with 2 properties and gradually built up a portfolio, that she's known in their office as someone who makes smart investments and pays attention to market trends." "Market trends? Mom doesn't even read the business section." "Apparently, she does more than read it." I heard the sound of someone sitting down heavily. "This changes everything," Bethany said finally. "No kidding. I mean, if she has this kind of money, we don't need to worry about her care costs. She can afford any kind of assisted living she wants." And there it was. Even faced with evidence that my mother was far more capable than they assumed, Bethany's first thought was still about managing me, just with better funding. "Bethany," Sarah said carefully, "I don't think assisted living is what she wants." "What she wants isn't really the issue here, Sarah. She's still 71 years old. She still needs oversight." "Oversight of what? A business portfolio she's been successfully managing for years without our help? She's been hiding things from us. That's not normal behavior." I almost laughed at that. Nothing about my children's recent behavior had been normal either, but they seemed incapable of applying that same analysis to themselves. "Maybe she had her reasons," Trevor said quietly. "What reasons? We're her family. Families don't hide financial information from each other." "Don't they?" Sarah's voice carried an edge I'd never heard before. "When exactly did you plan to tell your mother that you'd been researching ways to have her declared incompetent?" The silence that followed was absolute. "I never researched that," Bethany said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Your browser history says otherwise." "You looked at my browser history?" "Your mother apparently has it, along with recordings of phone calls." "She's been spying on us?" "She's been protecting herself," Trevor said, and I felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, one of my children was beginning to understand. Protecting herself from what? From us trying to help her? "From us trying to control her," Sarah said bluntly. "Because that's what we've been doing, Bethany. We decided she was declining. We decided she needed help. We decided where she should live. We never once asked her what she wanted. Because she's not thinking clearly." "Based on what evidence? The fact that she put salt in her coffee once? The fact that she forgot to lock her door? Those are signs of cognitive decline. Or they're signs of someone who was testing whether we were paying attention to her or just looking for reasons to support our predetermined conclusions." I heard Bethany's sharp intake of breath. "You think she did those things on purpose?" "I think we underestimated how smart she is. I think we saw what we expected to see instead of what was actually there." The conversation paused, and I heard paper rustling again. "There's more," Trevor said reluctantly. "I found something else in the mail." "What?"
A letter from her attorney about updated beneficiary designations. Beneficiary designations for what? Everything. The properties, the investments, the business sale proceeds, all of it. And we're not the primary beneficiaries anymore. The silence that followed was different from the previous pauses. This was the silence of people realizing that their actions might have consequences they hadn't considered. What do you mean we're not the primary beneficiaries? I mean, she's changed her will. The bulk of her estate is now designated for charitable organizations. Charitable organizations? A literacy foundation, a women's business development fund, and something called the Riverside Community Kitchen. She's giving our inheritance to strangers. The possessiveness in Bethany's voice was stunning, even to me. Our inheritance, as if my life's work belonged to them simply because they'd been born. It's her money, Bethany, Sarah said quietly. She can leave it to whoever she wants. But we're her children. Yes, and she raised us, educated us, and helped us get started in life. She doesn't owe us anything beyond that. Of course she does. That's what parents do. They leave their money to their children. Some parents do. Parents who feel their children have earned it. I could hear Bethany's breathing getting faster, more agitated. This is crazy. She's clearly not thinking straight. People don't just give millions of dollars to charity instead of their own family. Why not? Maybe she thinks charity will use it better than we would. That's ridiculous. Is it? What were we planning to do with her money, Bethany? Another silence. We were planning to make sure she was taken care of. No, we were planning to put her somewhere we didn't have to worry about her while we figured out how to manage her assets. That's not true. Isn't it? When's the last time you spent time with Mum just because you wanted to see her? Not because you were checking on her or trying to solve some problem you thought she had. I could hear Bethany struggling for an answer. We have busy lives. We have responsibilities. So does she, apparently. Responsibilities we knew nothing about because we stopped seeing her as a whole person years ago. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of a phone ringing. That's probably her calling back. Don't answer it. Why not? Because we need to figure out our strategy first. Our strategy. For dealing with this situation, for getting her to come home and talk to us rationally. Bethany, Sarah said slowly. You hear yourself right now. You're talking about strategizing against your own mother. I'm talking about helping someone who's clearly making irrational decisions. What's irrational about successfully managing a business and investment portfolio for decades? What's irrational is hiding it from your family and then running away from home like a teenager. She didn't run away. We told her she was a burden and needed to be institutionalized. She took us at our word and removed herself from the situation. We never said institutionalized. Assisted living, managed care, oversight, call it whatever you want. We told her she couldn't handle her own life anymore, and she proved us wrong. The phone stopped ringing, then immediately started again. She's not going to give up. Then we don't answer. We can't avoid her forever. We can until we figure out how to fix this. Fix what exactly? The will changes, the property transfers, all of it. There has to be a way to reverse this. Bethany, Sarah's voice was very quiet now. Listen to what you're saying. You want to reverse your mother's legal decisions about her own money because you don't like them. She's not thinking clearly. She's thinking more clearly than we are. She saw exactly what we were planning and took steps to protect herself. From her own children. From people who were treating her like an asset to be managed instead of a person to be loved. I don't understand how this happened. I thought we were doing the right thing. We thought we were doing the easy thing. There's a difference. The phone rang again. I'm answering it this time. Trevor, don't! But I heard the click of connection. Hi, Mum. Hello, Trevor. I wanted to check if you'd had a chance to review all the documents. We've been looking at them. And?
I could hear Bethany whispering urgently in the background, but couldn't make out the words. Mum, we need to talk. All of us. Together. I'm listening. No, I mean in person. Can you come home, please? This is my home now. You know what I mean. Actually, I don't. You told me I was a burden. You brought brochures for institutions where you wanted to store me. Why would I come back to that? Because we made a mistake. Which mistake? Underestimating my capabilities or getting caught doing it? Both. All of it. Mum, we're sorry.
I could hear the sincerity in his voice, but I could also hear Bethany's continued whispering, still strategizing, still trying to find an angle to work. Sorry isn't a magic word that undoes consequences, Trevor. You're going to have to prove you understand what you did wrong before we can discuss what happens next. How do we prove that? By demonstrating that you see me as your mother, not as a problem to be solved or an asset to be managed. Of course we see you as our mother. Then start acting like it. I hung up and turned off the phone. Tomorrow I would get a new number. Tonight I had plans to make. The attorney's office in downtown Millbrook was nothing like the imposing marble and mahogany spaces I'd expected. Rachel Morrison practiced from a converted Victorian house with mismatched furniture and walls lined with law books that looked actually read rather than decoratively arranged. She was younger than I'd anticipated, maybe 45, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and eyes that missed nothing. "Mrs. Hensley," she said, gesturing to a comfortable chair across from her cluttered desk. "I have to say, your timing is interesting." I'd driven into town that morning after 3 days of silence from my children. 3 days of not answering their increasingly frantic calls, not responding to their emails, not engaging with their attempts to draw me back into negotiations on their terms. 3 days of letting them sit with the reality of what they'd discovered. Interesting. How? Well, most people don't restructure their entire estate plan after their children suggest assisted living. They usually do it before family tensions reach that point. I settled into the chair and accepted the cup of coffee she offered. I had help seeing the situation clearly. The recordings you mentioned on the phone, among other things. Rachel opened a thick folder and spread documents across her desk. "I've reviewed everything you sent me, the financial statements, the property portfolios, the existing will and trust structures. It's impressive work, especially the way you've positioned everything for tax efficiency. My previous attorney was very thorough." Harold Whitman is legendary in estate planning circles, but he was also old school in his approach to family dynamics. She looked at me directly. "These new changes you want to make, they're not just about money distribution. They're about power." Explain. Your children expected to inherit your wealth, but more than that, they expected to control the process. By changing the beneficiary structure and adding these protective clauses, you're not just redirecting money. You're ensuring that no one can override your decisions, even if they manage to challenge your competency. I had spent the past 3 days walking the mountain trails around the cabin, thinking through exactly what I wanted to accomplish. Not just punishment for my children's betrayal, but protection for my own autonomy and purpose for the wealth I'd spent 30 years building. "I want to be very clear about something," I said. "This isn't about revenge. What is it about? It's about ensuring that my life's work serves the purposes I choose, not the purposes others assume I should choose." Rachel made notes on a legal pad. "Tell me about these organizations you want to benefit." The Literacy Foundation works with adult learners, people who fell through the cracks of the education system but are determined to change their lives. I've been volunteering with them for 12 years. Your children don't know about that? My children stopped asking about my activities years ago. They assumed because I didn't talk about work anymore, I wasn't doing anything meaningful.
and the Women's Business Development Fund. I mentor women who are starting their own catering and hospitality businesses. Most of them are single mothers like I was. They need more than money. They need someone who understands the challenges. Rachel looked up from her notes. You've been doing this mentoring for how long? 8 years, since I sold Riverside Catering. So while your children thought you were declining into a lonely retirement, you were actually building a second career in philanthropy. I wouldn't call it a career. I call it purpose. She flipped through more pages. The community kitchen project is ambitious. You're planning to fund an entire facility? The old Riverside Catering building has been sitting empty since I sold the business. The new owners were only interested in the client list and the recipes. They moved operations to a larger facility across town. I paused, remembering the day I'd walked through my old kitchen for the last time. I've been negotiating to buy the building back. To create a community kitchen? A place where people can learn culinary skills, where small food businesses can rent commercial kitchen space affordably, where community groups can prepare meals for local events. I set down my coffee cup. A place that serves the community instead of just extracting profit from it. Rachel was quiet for a moment, reading through the plans I'd drafted. Mrs. Hensley, this is a multi-million-dollar project. I'm aware of that. And you're planning to fund it entirely through your estate. Not entirely. I'm planning to begin funding it immediately. The estate provisions are to ensure it continues after I'm gone. You want to start this while you're still alive? I want to do more than start it. I want to run it. She leaned back in her chair, studying me with new attention. Your children think you need assisted living, and you're planning to launch a major business venture?
My children think I need assisted living because they've convinced themselves that anyone over 70 who doesn't live exactly as they think she should must be incapable of making rational decisions. And you disagree. I disagree with their assessment of my capabilities, their understanding of my desires, and their assumption that they have any right to make decisions about my life. Rachel made more notes. The trust structure you're proposing is quite sophisticated. It would make it nearly impossible for anyone to challenge your decisions or redirect the funds. That's the intention. Even if they could prove diminished capacity? Especially then. I've seen too many elderly people lose control of their life's work because their children decided they knew better. She closed the folder and looked at me directly. Mrs. Hensley, I have to ask, is any part of this decision motivated by anger at your children? I considered the question carefully. Was I angry? Yes. But anger had been the beginning of my clarity, not the end of it. 3 months ago, I might have said yes, but I've had time to think. Time to plan. Time to remember who I am when I'm not trying to meet other people's expectations. And who is that? Someone who built a successful business from nothing. Someone who raised 2 children alone and put them through college. Someone who has spent the last decade quietly building relationships and expertise in areas I care about. I paused. Someone who is not ready to be warehoused just because her children find her inconvenient. Rachel nodded slowly. The trust structure you're proposing is quite sophisticated. It would make it nearly impossible for anyone to challenge your decisions or redirect the funds. That's the intention. Even if they could prove diminished capacity? Especially then. I've seen too many elderly people lose control of their life's work because their children decided they knew better. Are you prepared for their reaction when they realize the full scope of what you've done? I thought about the 3 days of silence, about the messages they'd left that I hadn't returned, about the emails from Bethany alternating between apology and demand. I'm prepared for them to be upset. I'm prepared for them to fight it. I'm prepared for them to claim I'm not thinking clearly. I met her eyes. What I won't accept is them treating me like their decision to make. Rachel opened her laptop and began typing. All right, let's build something bulletproof.
The next 3 hours were spent crafting legal language that would protect not just my money, but my autonomy. Trust structures that couldn't be challenged, beneficiary designations that couldn't be overturned, and decision-making protocols that left no room for outside interference. The irrevocable trust is the key, Rachel explained as we reviewed the final documents. Once you sign this, even you can't change the beneficiaries or redirect the funds. But you retain complete control over the timing and implementation. So, if I decided tomorrow that I wanted to reconcile with my children, you could include them in operational decisions about the foundation and the community kitchen. You could hire them, work with them, involve them in the day-to-day management, but the underlying structure would remain unchanged. And if they continued to treat me as incompetent, then they would have no legal standing to interfere with your decisions about the organizations you're funding. I signed the documents methodically, each signature feeling like a door closing on one version of my life and opening on another. There's one more thing, Rachel said as I finished. Your children will eventually discover what you've done, probably sooner rather than later given how closely they seem to be monitoring your finances. I'm counting on it. They'll likely contact you immediately. They may threaten legal action, claim you're being manipulated, demand meetings. And you need to decide how you want to handle those conversations, whether you want to engage at all, and if so, on what terms. I gathered my copies of the documents and tucked them into my purse. I want them to understand that treating someone like a burden has consequences. But I also want them to understand that those consequences aren't permanent. They're just no longer under their control. You're leaving the door open for reconciliation, but only on your terms. I'm leaving the door open for them to earn back the trust they chose to break. Rachel walked me to the front door of her office. Mrs. Hensley, in 30 years of practice, I've seen a lot of family conflicts over money and control. Most of them end badly because people dig in and refuse to see the other side's perspective. And I think you might be the first person I've met who's figured out how to protect herself without destroying the possibility of repair. I drove back to the cabin feeling lighter than I had in months. Not because I'd won some victory over my children, but because I'd finally stopped letting their limited vision of me define what I was capable of becoming. That evening, I made dinner and sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and rose. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of buying back the Riverside Catering building. Next week, I would start reaching out to potential partners for the community kitchen project.
My phone sat silent on the table beside me. Eventually, my children would figure out what I'd done, and when they did, we would all discover whether they were capable of seeing me as someone worth respecting, instead of someone who needed managing. Until then, I had work to do. The notification arrived at 11:43 a.m. on a Thursday, exactly 6 days after I'd signed the irrevocable trust documents. I was standing in the empty shell of my old Riverside Catering building, measuring counter space with Marcus Webb, the contractor I'd hired to oversee the community kitchen renovation, when my phone buzzed with an alert from my bank's fraud protection system. Attempted unauthorized access to account ending in 7394. Transaction blocked. Please contact us immediately if this was not you. I knew exactly which account that was, the money market account Trevor had discovered in my forwarded mail, the one with $347,000 that had apparently caught someone's attention. Marcus was explaining ventilation requirements for commercial kitchens, but I held up a hand to pause him and called the bank's security line. "Mrs. Hensley, thank you for calling so quickly," the representative said after I had verified my identity. "We had an attempt to add a joint account holder to your money market account at 10:15 this morning. The request came from someone claiming to be your son, Trevor Hensley." Claiming to be? Well, he provided correct identification, but he didn't have your authorization code or the account security questions answered correctly. Our system flagged it as suspicious because he seemed frustrated that he couldn't provide certain information. I could picture Trevor at the bank,
probably with Bethany beside him, both of them armed with my address, my social security number, and the confidence that comes from believing you understand a situation completely. What exactly was he trying to do? Add himself as a joint account holder with full access rights. He said you'd asked him to handle this, but were too confused to come in yourself. My chest tightened with something between anger and vindication. Even after discovering my financial capabilities, they were still trying to position me as incompetent. And what did you tell him? That you'd need to be present in person with proper identification to make any changes to account ownership, and that we'd be contacting you immediately to verify the request. I see. And did he leave any contact information? He did, and he asked to speak with a manager about our inflexible policies regarding elderly customers who need family assistance. I thanked the representative and hung up, then immediately called Rachel Morrison. They moved faster than I expected, she said after I explained what had happened. Is there any way they could actually gain access? Not to that account, not with the security measures you have in place. But Dorothy, this tells us something important about their mindset. They're not approaching this as a family reconciliation. They're approaching it as a financial emergency. I was still standing in the empty building that would soon become a community kitchen, surrounded by possibilities I was finally free to pursue. The irony wasn't lost on me that my children were trying to seize control of my money while I stood in the space where I planned to give much of it away. What should I expect next? Escalation. If they can't access your accounts through normal channels, they'll look for legal options. As if summoned by her words, my phone rang. Bethany's number. Should I answer it? That's up to you, but if you do, remember that anything you say could potentially be used if they decide to pursue legal action. I declined the call and watched as it immediately rang again. Then again. Marcus had been politely pretending not to listen, but now he looked concerned. Everything okay, Mrs. Hensley? Family drama, I said simply. Nothing that should affect the renovation timeline. My phone buzzed with a text from Bethany. Mom, we need to talk. Trevor tried to help you at the bank and they treated him terribly. Something is wrong with your accounts. Then another from Trevor. Mom, please call us back. We're worried the bank is taking advantage of you. Then Sarah, whose messages were usually more thoughtful. Dorothy, the kids are really upset. Can you at least let us know you're safe? I showed the messages to Rachel, who'd stayed on the line. They're building a narrative. Financial exploitation by the bank, family members being denied access to help a vulnerable elderly person. If they pursue legal action, these will be their talking points. And my talking points? Adult woman of sound mind making informed decisions about her own money, which she's been successfully managing for decades. That afternoon, I drove back to the cabin to find a car parked in my driveway, a dark sedan with rental plates. Through the front window, I could see someone sitting in the driver's seat, talking on the phone. I parked behind the sedan, effectively blocking it in, and walked to the driver's side window. The man inside looked up startled. He was young, maybe early 30s, wearing a cheap suit and holding a folder thick with documents. Mrs. Dorothy Hensley? Who's asking?
My name is Jeff Patterson. I'm a process server. I have some documents for you. He handed me the folder through the car window. You've been served. I waited until he'd maneuvered around my car and driven away before opening the folder. Petition for emergency guardianship and conservatorship, the header read, in the matter of Dorothy Rose Hensley, an allegedly incapacitated person. The petitioners were listed as Bethany Marie Hensley Crawford and Trevor James Hensley. The document was filed in their home county, 3 states away, claiming I was suffering from cognitive decline and vulnerability to financial exploitation, and requesting immediate intervention to protect her assets and well-being. The supporting evidence they'd submitted was laughable if it hadn't been so insulting. The salt and coffee incident,
The unlocked door, my sudden disappearance from my home, my erratic financial behavior, including impulsive property purchases and suspicious account activity. They'd also submitted affidavits from neighbors claiming I'd seemed confused and forgetful in recent months, and a statement from Dr. Patricia Lyons, Bethany's friend who worked in geriatric medicine, suggesting that my behavior was consistent with early-stage dementia. Dr. Lyons had never examined me. She'd met me exactly twice, both times at Bethany's house for social gatherings, where I'd been polite but quiet. I called Rachel immediately. "They filed in their jurisdiction, not yours," she said after I read her the relevant sections. "That's both good and bad news." Explain. Bad news is they're trying to forum shop, file where they think they'll get a more sympathetic hearing. Good news is it makes their case weaker because you're not a resident of their county. What happens next? You have the right to contest jurisdiction and demand the case be transferred to Colorado. You also have the right to independent medical evaluation and legal representation at the hearing. When is the hearing? Emergency petitions usually get scheduled within 72 hours. You'll need to decide quickly whether to fight the jurisdiction or let it proceed and focus on defending the merits. I sat on my cabin porch reading through the petition again. My children had taken sworn statements claiming I was incompetent. They asked a doctor who barely knew me to provide a medical opinion about my mental state. They'd enlisted neighbors to testify about my decline. They'd built an entire legal case around the premise that I couldn't be trusted to make decisions about my own life. Rachel, if they win this petition, what happens to the irrevocable trust? The trust itself can't be undone. That's why it's irrevocable. But a conservator could potentially challenge decisions you made in the lead up to creating it, especially if they can establish a timeline of diminishing capacity. So they could still get control of my money? They could try. It would be a complex legal battle, but yes, it's possible. I closed my eyes and thought about my options. I could fight the jurisdiction and delay the proceedings. I could submit to their chosen venue and focus on proving my competency. Or I could take a third option that they probably hadn't considered. Rachel, how quickly can we get me in front of a doctor for an independent cognitive evaluation? I can make some calls. Why? Because I want to remove any doubt about my mental state before this hearing. I want documentation that's more recent and more thorough than anything they can present. That's smart. But Rachel, there's something else you should consider. What? Your children are going to be at this hearing. Are you prepared to sit in a courtroom while they testify under oath that you're incompetent? I thought about the little girl who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms and the boy who'd brought me dandelions from the yard because he thought they were prettier than store-bought flowers. I thought about the young adults I'd been so proud of when they graduated college, got married, started families of their own. Then I thought about the adults who'd researched ways to have me declared incompetent so they could control my assets. I'm prepared for them to discover what happens when you underestimate someone who's been protecting herself longer than they've been alive. All right then, let's build a defense that leaves no room for doubt. That evening, I called Marcus Webb and told him to accelerate the renovation timeline. Any particular reason for the rush? He asked. I want to be standing in a fully operational community kitchen when I tell my children exactly what they've lost by treating me like a burden they needed to manage. Consider it done. The next morning, I drove to Denver for a comprehensive neuropsychological evaluation with Dr. Amanda Foster, the specialist Rachel had recommended. 6 hours of cognitive testing, memory assessments, and psychological evaluation that would either validate my competency or confirm my children's worst fears. But I wasn't worried. I knew exactly who I was and what I was capable of. The question was whether my children would recognize that woman when they finally came face to face with her in court. The courthouse in Westfield County was exactly what I had expected. Imposing limestone columns, marble floors that echoed with every footstep, and the kind of institutional gravity that was designed to make people feel small. I arrived 45 minutes early, carrying a leather portfolio that contained 6 months of preparation my children knew nothing about.
Dr. Amanda Foster's neuropsychological evaluation had been comprehensive and conclusive. Cognitive function in the 94th percentile for my age group. Memory recall superior to most people 20 years younger. Executive reasoning skills that the doctor had described as exceptionally sharp in her written report. 0 indicators of dementia, cognitive decline, or impaired judgment.
Rachel Morrison met me in the lobby, looking professional in a navy suit that commanded respect without appearing aggressive. She'd flown in from Colorado specifically for this hearing, bringing with her a file thick enough to stop a truck. "How are you feeling?" she asked as we walked toward the elevator. "Like someone who's about to teach her children the difference between loving someone and owning them." The courtroom was smaller than I'd imagined, with wood paneling and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly sickly. Bethany and Trevor were already seated at the petitioner's table with their attorney, a thin man in an expensive suit who looked like he specialized in extracting money from complicated family situations. When Bethany saw me walk in, her face went through a series of expressions: relief, surprise, and then something that looked almost like fear. "I suppose seeing your supposedly confused and vulnerable mother arrive with professional legal representation tends to adjust expectations." Trevor looked worse than I'd seen him in years. His suit was wrinkled, his hair uncombed, and his eyes had the hollow look of someone who'd been sleeping poorly. When our eyes met across the courtroom, he had the grace to look ashamed. Judge Patricia Valdez entered with the kind of brisk efficiency that suggested she'd dealt with family guardianship cases before and had little patience for dramatics. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe 50, with graying hair and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "This is an emergency petition for guardianship and conservatorship," she said, settling behind the bench. "Mr. Harrison, you're representing the petitioners?" The thin man stood. "Yes, Your Honor, David Harrison, representing Bethany Crawford and Trevor Hensley, who are seeking emergency intervention to protect their mother from financial exploitation and the consequences of her declining cognitive abilities." "And Ms. Morrison, you're representing the proposed ward?" Rachel stood with the kind of confidence that filled the room. "Yes, Your Honor. Rachel Morrison, representing Dorothy Hensley, who contests both the jurisdiction of this court and the factual basis for this petition." Let's address jurisdiction first. The next 20 minutes were a legal chess match that would have impressed my grandfather, who'd always said that preparation was the difference between victory and hoping for the best. Rachel methodically dismantled my children's forum shopping, demonstrating that I was a Colorado resident with no significant ties to Westfield County beyond my children's residence. "Your Honor," Harrison argued, "Mrs. Hensley lived in this county for over 30 years. Her entire support network is here. Moving her case to Colorado would isolate her from family and friends who are concerned about her welfare." "Mr. Harrison," Judge Valdez replied dryly, "Mrs. Hensley moved to Colorado of her own volition. If she has a support network there and has established residency, this court's jurisdiction is questionable at best." But I caught Rachel's arm as she started to make the motion to transfer. "I want the hearing to proceed here," I said quietly. "Dorothy, we can get this moved to friendlier territory." "No, I want them to present their case in front of a judge who will hear all the facts. I want this finished today." Rachel looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. "Your Honor, my client waives the jurisdictional challenge and consents to this court's jurisdiction for the purpose of resolving this matter expeditiously." Judge Valdez raised an eyebrow. "Very well. Mr. Harrison, present your case." What followed was 45 minutes of character assassination disguised as concern. Harrison called Dr. Patricia Lyons, who testified about my obvious cognitive decline based on 2 brief social interactions. He presented the affidavits from neighbors who claimed I seemed confused and forgetful. He played up the salt in coffee incident, the unlocked door, and my sudden abandonment of my home. "Your Honor," Harrison concluded, "Mrs. Hensley's children love her and are trying to protect her from her own declining judgment. The evidence clearly shows a pattern of cognitive deterioration and vulnerability to exploitation." Then it was Rachel's turn. She started with Dr. Foster's neuropsychological evaluation, reading key portions aloud. Cognitive function at the 94th percentile for my age group. Memory recall superior to most people 20 years younger. Executive reasoning skills that the doctor had described as exceptionally sharp in her written report. 0 indicators of dementia, cognitive decline, or impaired judgment.
She presented my financial records, demonstrating not cognitive decline, but sophisticated asset management over multiple decades, property acquisition timelines that showed strategic planning, not impulsive decisions, investment portfolios that had consistently outperformed market averages. Your Honor, Rachel said, Miss Hensley didn't suddenly become wealthy and start making irrational decisions. She has been successfully managing a complex financial portfolio for years, while her children remained oblivious to her capabilities. Then she played the recordings. The courtroom fell completely silent as my children's voices filled the air. Trevor discussing with his financial advisor how to optimize Mom's estate transition. Bethany researching legal options for having me declared incompetent. Their conversation about dividing my house and planning my asset transition before I was even gone.
When the recordings ended, the silence stretched so long I could hear the ventilation system humming in the walls. Your Honor, Rachel continued, Mrs. Hensley didn't develop paranoid behavior. She developed protective behavior in response to her children's attempts to control her life and assets. Judge Valdez looked directly at my children's table. Mr. Harrison, do your clients have any response to these recordings? Harrison looked like a man who just discovered his entire case had been built on quicksand. Your Honor, adult children often discuss their parents' future care needs. These conversations, taken out of context— Mr. Harrison, the judge interrupted, these recordings document your clients researching how to have their mother declared incompetent while simultaneously planning how to dispose of her assets. That doesn't sound like care planning to me. Then Rachel called me to testify. I walked to the witness stand calmly, my hand steady as I swore to tell the truth. For the next 20 minutes, I laid out my history methodically. The business I'd built and successfully operated for 23 years, the investments I'd made and managed, the volunteer work I'd been doing, the community projects I was funding. Mrs. Hensley, Rachel asked, why did you record your children's conversations? Because I could see where their concern was leading, and I wanted to protect myself from decisions made on false assumptions about my capabilities. And why did you move to Colorado? Because my children told me I was a burden they could no longer manage. I took them at their word and removed the burden. Do you feel you need a guardian or conservator? I feel I need children who see me as their mother rather than as a problem to be solved. When Harrison cross-examined me, he tried to paint my actions as vindictive and irrational, but every question he asked gave me another opportunity to demonstrate exactly how clearly I was thinking. Mrs. Hensley, don't you think your children were just trying to help you? Mr. Harrison, if someone researches ways to have you declared incompetent and discusses dividing your property while you're still alive, would you consider that helpful? But surely you understand their concern about your living alone. I understand their concern about controlling my assets. I've seen no evidence of concern about my actual well-being. Judge Valdez called a brief recess. When she returned, her expression was grim. I've reviewed all the evidence presented today, the medical evaluation, the financial records, the testimony, and yes, the recordings of the petitioners discussing their mother's future. She looked directly at Bethany and Trevor. I find no evidence that Mrs. Hensley suffers from any cognitive impairment or lacks the capacity to manage her own affairs. In fact, the evidence suggests she has been managing complex financial and business matters with considerable skill for decades. Harrison tried to interrupt, but Judge Valdez held up her hand. What I do find troubling is the petitioner's apparent focus on controlling their mother's assets rather than supporting her autonomy. The recordings suggest a pattern of behavior that raises questions about the petitioner's motivations. She turned to me. Mrs. Hensley, you are clearly competent to make your own decisions about your life, your residence, and your finances. This petition is denied in its entirety. The gavel came down with a sound like thunder. As people began filing out of the courtroom, Bethany approached me. Her face was streaked with tears, but her expression was hard. Are you happy now? You've destroyed our family over money.
I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, and saw a stranger wearing the face of the little girl I'd raised. Bethany, I didn't destroy our family. I revealed what it had already become. We were trying to help you. You were trying to control me. There's a difference. Trevor appeared beside his sister, looking defeated. Mom, we made mistakes, but this is too much. You've cut us out of everything. I've cut you out of managing me. Whether you're cut out of loving me is entirely up to you. And with that, I walked out of the courthouse where my children had tried to have me declared incompetent and drove back to Colorado to finish building the life they'd accidentally given me permission to start. 6 weeks after the courthouse showdown, I was standing in my fully renovated community kitchen, watching Elena Rodriguez teach a group of single mothers how to prepare meals in commercial quantities. The space hummed with purposeful energy, industrial mixers churning, prep tables covered with fresh vegetables, and the kind of focused conversation that happens when people are learning skills that could change their lives. The transformation of the old Riverside catering building had been remarkable. Marcus Webb and his crew had worked miracles, installing commercial-grade equipment, creating separate areas for food preparation and packaging, and building a small classroom where I could host business development workshops. The walls were painted warm yellow, natural light poured through skylights we'd added, and the entire space felt alive in a way it never had when I was running a traditional catering business. Mrs. Hensley, Elena called from across the kitchen, Mrs. Patterson wants to know if you think her salsa recipe would work for the farmer's market booth. I walked over to where Janet Patterson was spooning her homemade salsa into small containers. Janet was 43, recently divorced, and trying to build a food business that could support her 3 children. 6 months ago, she'd never imagined herself as an entrepreneur. Today, she was calculating profit margins and discussing vendor permits.
Janet, this salsa is restaurant quality, I said after tasting it. But before you commit to the farmer's market, let's run some numbers on your cost per unit and see what kind of volume you'd need to make it profitable. Her face lit up with the kind of excitement I remembered from my own early business days, the moment when possibility transforms from dream to plan. My phone buzzed with a text from Rachel Morrison. Have you seen today's local news? Check Channel 7's website. I excused myself and pulled up the news story on my phone. The headline read, Local woman wins fight against children's guardianship attempt, now funding community kitchen. The article was thorough and surprisingly accurate. It detailed the court case, my business background, and the community kitchen project. But what caught my attention was the quote from an unnamed source, described as a family member close to the situation. Dorothy has always been secretive about money. We were genuinely concerned about her welfare. But it turns out she was planning this vindictive scheme all along. She's using her wealth to punish us for caring about her. I didn't need to guess which family member had spoken to the reporter. The article also included a quote from Dr. Foster, who had provided a professional assessment. Mrs. Hensley demonstrated cognitive abilities well above average for her age group. The suggestion that she needs guardianship appears to have been based on misconceptions rather than medical evidence. By evening, my phone was ringing constantly. Local recorders wanted interviews. A producer from a regional television show wanted to discuss featuring the community kitchen. 3 different lawyers called, offering to represent me if my children appealed the guardianship decision. But the call that surprised me most came at 8:30 p.m. after I'd returned to the cabin and was sitting on the porch with a cup of tea. Mom, it's Sarah. Trevor's wife sounded tired, strained, in a way I'd never heard before. Hello, Sarah. I saw the news story today. I imagine you did? Mom, I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen without hanging up. Can you do that? I considered the request. Sarah had been the most reasonable voice in the family throughout this entire ordeal. I'm listening. Trevor and Bethany are talking about appealing the judge's decision. They think they can find a different court that will be more sympathetic to their case. I wasn't surprised, but hearing it confirmed still sent a chill through me. And
What do you think about that? I think they're destroying what's left of this family over money they were never entitled to in the first place. The honesty in her voice was refreshing after months of careful family diplomacy. Go on. I've been watching them since the court hearing, and I don't recognize the people they've become. Trevor spends hours researching asset recovery strategies and talking to lawyers about overturning irrevocable trusts. Bethany has convinced herself that you're some kind of criminal mind master who manipulated the legal system. I sipped my tea and watched stars appear in the darkening sky. And what do you see when you look at me, Sarah? I see a woman who spent 30 years raising children who turned out to be greedy and entitled, and who finally got tired of being treated like their retirement plan. The bluntness of her assessment was both painful and validating. I also see a woman who's doing more good with her money in 6 weeks than most people do in a lifetime. Thank you for that. Don't thank me yet. I have more to tell you. I waited. Trevor cleaned out his savings account last week to pay for a lawyer who specializes in challenging elder law decisions. Bethany took out a second mortgage on her house to fund what she's calling getting mom the help she needs. My chest tightened. They're spending their own money to try to take mine? They're spending money they don't have because they're convinced that your wealth belongs to them. And, Mom, they're not going to stop. I closed my eyes and thought about the little boy who used to bring me dandelions, and the little girl who used to help me bake cookies every Sunday. What would you do, Sarah, if you were in my position? I'd document everything they're doing and make sure my lawyer is prepared for round 2, but I'd also grieve for the children you thought you raised, because those people are gone. After Sarah hung up, I sat in the darkness for a long time, thinking about consequences and the difference between justice and revenge. My children were bankrupting themselves to try to control me. They were destroying their marriages, their financial security, and their relationships with their own children, all because they couldn't accept that I had the right to make decisions about my own life. The next morning, I called Rachel and relayed Sarah's information. She said, "I'm not surprised. Losing in court often escalates these situations rather than resolving them. Are you prepared for a prolonged legal battle?" "I'm prepared for whatever it takes to protect my autonomy." "What about the emotional cost? These are your children we're talking about." I looked out the cabin window at the mountains, thinking about the community kitchen full of people pursuing their dreams, about the literacy foundation that was helping adults learn to read, about the business mentorship program that was empowering women to build their own companies.
Rachel, my children made a choice when they decided to treat me like a problem to be solved instead of a person to be loved. I've made my choice too, which is to use my remaining years building something meaningful instead of waiting for people to love me who've already decided I'm not worth respecting. That afternoon, I drove to the community kitchen and found Janet Patterson in the office area, working on her business plan with Elena's help. They'd spread papers across the entire table: market research, cost projections, supplier contacts, and licensing requirements. "How's it going?" I asked. "It's overwhelming," Janet admitted, "but good overwhelming. Like the kind of overwhelming you get when you realize you might actually be able to do something you never thought was possible." I understood that feeling completely. "Janet, I want to ask you something. If someone told you that pursuing this business was a mistake, that you should let other people make decisions about your future because they knew better than you did, what would you say?" She looked at me with surprise. "I'd say they were crazy. This is my life, my choice, my risk to take. Even if those people were your family, even if they claimed they were trying to protect you, especially then," she said firmly. "The people who love you should want you to succeed, not want you to play it safe." Elena nodded in agreement.
My grandmother always said that when people try to make you smaller, it's usually because your growth threatens their comfort. I thought about that wisdom as I drove back to the cabin. My growth, my refusal to shrink into the manageable, dependent role my children wanted me to play, had threatened their comfort so much that they were willing to destroy themselves financially to try to force me back into that box. That evening, I made 2 phone calls. The first was to my accountant, instructing him to set up a separate legal defense fund that could handle whatever appeals my children might file. I wasn't going to let their determination to control me drain resources from the community projects I was funding. The second call was to the producer who'd contacted me about featuring the community kitchen on television. I've decided to do the interview, but I want to talk about more than just the kitchen. I want to talk about what happens when families confuse love with control and what it costs everyone involved. That's a powerful story. Are you sure you want to make it public? I'm sure, because somewhere out there are other elderly people whose families are treating them like burdens instead of human beings. And somewhere out there are adult children who think they're helping by taking control instead of offering support. When can we schedule the filming? As soon as possible. I have work to do, and I don't want to waste any more time on people who've confused managing me with loving me. The next morning, I woke up to find a letter that had been slipped under my cabin door during the night. No postmark, no return address, just my name written in Bethany's familiar handwriting. Inside was a single page covered in her neat script. Mom, I know you think we're terrible people, but we're your children, and we love you. Everything we did was because we were scared of losing you. Maybe we went about it wrong, but our hearts were in the right place. Please come home. Please let us try again. We miss our mother. I read the letter twice, then walked to the fireplace and watched it burn. My children missed having a mother they could manage. They didn't miss the woman I actually was, because they'd never bothered to get to know her. But other people had, and that woman had work to do. 2 years later, I was standing in the same community kitchen, but everything had changed. The space was twice as large now, thanks to an expansion that had added a retail storefront, a teaching amphitheater, and office space for the 12 small businesses that had launched from our programs. Janet Patterson's salsa company now employed 6 people and distributed to grocery stores across 3 states. Elena Rodriguez had opened her own catering business and was mentoring the next wave of entrepreneurs. The morning light streaming through the skylights illuminated something I'd never expected to see. A familiar figure standing near the entrance, holding a bouquet of sunflowers and looking uncertain. Sarah. She'd aged in the 2 years since our last conversation. There were lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before, and her hair had more gray, but her expression was different from the strained woman who'd called to warn me about Trevor and Bethany's plans. This was the face of someone who'd found peace with difficult truths. Dorothy, I hope it's okay that I came. How did you find me? The television interview you did last year, and the article in Entrepreneur magazine about the community kitchen program. I've been following your work from a distance. I gestured toward the small cafe area we'd added, where customers could buy prepared foods from our entrepreneurs while they worked. We sat at a corner table, and Sarah placed the sunflowers between us. These are beautiful, thank you. They're from my garden. I remembered they were your favorite.
We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the bustle of activity around us. 3 women were packaging homemade granola for delivery orders. A man was teaching his teenage son how to calculate food costs for a food truck business. In the teaching kitchen, a group of seniors was learning to prepare healthy meals on fixed incomes. Sarah, how are Trevor and Bethany? Her expression clouded. That's part of why I'm here. I waited. The appeals failed, all of them.
They spent 18 months and nearly $100,000 on lawyers who kept telling them what they wanted to hear instead of what they needed to know. And now? Trevor and I divorced 6 months ago. I felt a stab of pain, not for the loss of my son's marriage, but for Sarah, who'd tried to be the voice of reason throughout the entire ordeal. I'm sorry. Don't be. It was the right decision. He became someone I didn't recognize, someone obsessed with what he thought was rightfully his, instead of grateful for what he actually had. She traced the rim of her coffee cup with one finger. The children barely speak to him now. They remember the grandfather who used to play board games with them, not the bitter man who spent their college funds on lawsuits. And Bethany? Bethany lost her house. The second mortgage, the legal fees, the stress on her marriage, it all collapsed. She and Mark separated last spring. I closed my eyes, thinking about the little girl who used to help me bake cookies, who'd grown into a woman so focused on controlling others that she'd destroyed her own life in the process. Where is she now? Living in a studio apartment, working retail, and still convinced that you somehow orchestrated all of this to punish her. Sarah met my eyes. She's still talking about finding a way to challenge the trust. With what resources? That's what I asked her. She doesn't have an answer. I watched Janet Patterson explaining inventory management to a new entrepreneur. Her confidence and competence evident in every gesture. 2 years ago, she was a recently divorced woman with no business experience and 3 children to support. Today, she was building something that would provide security for her family and employment for others. Sarah, why are you here? Because I wanted to see what you'd built. Because I wanted to understand what we lost when we decided you were a burden instead of recognizing that you were a gift. The words hit harder than I'd expected. I'd built walls around the part of me that had once been a mother, focusing on the work, the community, the legacy I was creating. But sitting across from Sarah, I felt something crack open that I'd thought was permanently sealed. Also, she continued, because I wanted to apologize. You weren't the one trying to control me. No, but I was the one who stayed silent while it happened. I saw what Trevor and Bethany were doing, and instead of speaking up, I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere in family business. She pulled a manila envelope from her purse and placed it on the table. What's this? Documentation of everything they spent trying to overturn your decisions. Legal fees, court costs, expert witness payments, travel expenses, all of it. I opened the envelope and scanned the papers inside. The numbers were staggering. In their determination to gain control of my wealth, my children had spent more money than most people see in a lifetime. Why are you showing me this? Because I want you to understand the full scope of what their obsession cost them, and because I think you should know that their lawyers advised them to stop after the first appeal failed. They chose to continue. I closed the envelope and slid it back to her. Sarah, what do you want from me? Nothing. I want to give you something. She reached into her purse again and pulled out a photo. It was recent. My 2 grandchildren, now teenagers, standing in Sarah's garden with genuine smiles. They ask about you, she said quietly. Not about the money or the court cases or any of the drama. They ask about their grandmother who used to tell stories and teach them to cook and remember every detail of their school projects. I stared at the photo, seeing echoes of Trevor's childhood face in his son, flashes of my own mother's expression in his daughter. They don't understand why their father is so angry all the time, or why their mother chooses bitterness over building something new. But they remember the woman who saw potential in everyone and taught them that kindness was a choice, not a weakness. My throat tightened. What are you asking me? I'm asking if someday, when they're adults making their own decisions, you might be willing to know them. not as Trevor's children, but as themselves. I looked around the community kitchen, at the lives being built and dreams being pursued, at the legacy I'd created from the ashes of my family's betrayal. Then I looked back at Sarah, who'd driven across 3 states to offer me something I hadn't dared to hope for. Connection without control, love without conditions. Sarah, do they know you came here? They know I was going to try to find you. They asked me to tell you that they miss you, and that they don't blame you for protecting yourself.
And their father? Does he know? Trevor knows I filed for divorce because I couldn't watch him destroy himself over money that was never his. He doesn't know I'm here, and I don't plan to tell him unless you want me to. I picked up the photo and studied it more carefully. The children, young adults now, had their mother's eyes, but something else too. A quality I recognized from my own childhood, from watching my grandmother navigate difficulties with grace and determination. What are their plans? College? Careers? Emma wants to study social work. She says she wants to help families communicate better so they don't fall apart like ours did. Jake is interested in sustainable agriculture and food systems. I almost smiled at the irony. My grandchildren had chosen paths that aligned more closely with my values than their father's dreams of inherited wealth ever had. Sarah, I can't promise anything about reconciliation with Trevor or Bethany. I'm not asking you to. But if Emma and Jake want to reach out when they're ready, if they want to know about their grandmother's work or learn about business or just talk about life without the complications their parents created, you'd be open to that? I'd be honored by that. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. They might decide they don't want anything to do with their grandfather's money or their grandmother's choices. They might. But they might also decide they want to be part of something bigger than themselves, something that helps other people instead of just accumulating wealth. I stood up and walked to the window overlooking the main kitchen area. Janet was training a new volunteer, patiently explaining food safety protocols. Elena was reviewing business plans with 2 women who wanted to start a food truck. In the corner, an elderly man was teaching his granddaughter how to make bread from scratch. Sarah, what I've built here isn't about the money. It's about what happens when people are given respect, resources, and the freedom to pursue their own vision of success. I know. My children never understood that distinction. They saw wealth as something to be possessed rather than something to be used. They saw my autonomy as a threat to their security rather than a model for building their own. I turned back to face her. If Emma and Jake want to be part of this world, they need to understand that it's not about inheriting my values, it's about developing their own and having the courage to live by them. I think they already understand that better than their parents ever did. That evening, after Sarah had driven back home, I sat on my cabin porch with the photo of my grandchildren propped against a coffee mug. The mountains were painted gold and purple in the sunset, and the air carried the scent of pine and possibility. I thought about the woman I'd been 2 years ago, standing in my old kitchen while my children told me I was a burden. I thought about the journey from that moment of betrayal to this moment of potential reconciliation, not with the people who'd tried to control me, but with the people who might choose to know me. My phone buzzed with a text from Janet. Mrs. Hensley, the granola orders came in. We're going to need to hire 2 more people next month. Thank you for believing in something I couldn't even see myself. I typed back, thank you for teaching me that the best legacy isn't what you leave behind, it's what you build while you're still here to see it grow. The next morning, I would return to the community kitchen and continue the work that had become my true inheritance. Not the wealth I'd accumulated, but the purpose I'd discovered. I would mentor new entrepreneurs, support innovative programs, and build something that would outlast any family drama or court battle. And someday, if I was very fortunate,
I might have the chance to teach my grandchildren that the most valuable thing you can pass on isn't money or property, but the knowledge that you have the power to create something meaningful with whatever time and resources you've been given. The people who called me a burden actually gave me the greatest gift of all, the freedom to discover what I was actually capable of when no one was trying to manage my choices or limit my possibilities. I wasn't just surviving their betrayal, I was thriving because of it. Have you ever discovered that the people who tried to diminish you actually freed you to become who you were meant to be? Sometimes the greatest gift comes disguised as the deepest loss, and sometimes the family you build is more loving than the family you were born into. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.